Herbs and spices is what we're going to talk about, and how to transform food from dull to delicious. All right. So the things that we're going to specifically focus on today are going to be what are herbs, what are spices, what I like to call herbology, which is some of the history of herbs, talking about its antioxidant effect, the top 10 herbs and spices, basic infusions, tips for working with herbs and spices, and storing your herbs and spices. So lots to talk about. But before we get started, I have a quick question. Do any of you have, or have you already started your gardens? Anyone have an herb garden, indoors or outdoors? I personally have a windowsill one I just started because I live in an apartment, so I don't have that option of being outdoors. Kathy, what kind do you have? Indoors or outdoors? Outdoors, yeah, lucky. That's when you know spring has sprung. Patty, you were doing the planter one on the patio. I love it. Yeah, I mean, so I think it's something that's easy to do no matter what your living situation is, indoors, outdoors, whatever the limited space is. What's really great about herbs and spices is they grow literally like weeds, and you can do them anywhere. Okay. Oh, the planter. Yeah, I wish I had a deck or even a patio right now. That would probably work out well for me. But I do have a sunroom, and as the name implies, it gets a lot of sunlight. So mine are growing like weeds. Okay, so herbs, if we talk about what are herbs, they are leaves of low-growing shrubs. So examples include things like parsley, chives, marjoram, thyme, basil, caraway, dill, oregano, rosemary, sage, and even celery. And they can be fresh or dried, and dried can be whole, crushed, or ground. Okay. Now, I wanted to include this. It'll probably be easier when you download it yourself, and I would totally suggest printing this out and putting it up on the refrigerator, or if you have a cookbook, you know, where you keep your own recipes, always great to stick it in there as a reference. What I really like about this, we have a guide to herbs. We also have one coming up on spices as well. And it talks about how you can mix it with different proteins, and I just think this is a great reference sheet to have. So, you know, because sometimes we get super enthusiastic about being able to grow this stuff, which is fine, but then we're like, wait, what do I do with it? So I thought this would be a perfect resource to have. Okay. If we talk about spices, so spices come from things like bark, that's where cinnamon comes from, roots like ginger, onion, and garlic, buds like cloves or saffron, seeds like yellow mustard, poppy, and sesame, berries, black pepper, and the fruit of tropical plants or trees, excuse me, like allspice and paprika. Okay, and now, let's turn about this fair play. As we have one for herbs, we need to have a chart for spices, and it's the same setup. So definitely print these out and try to see how you can combine them to really add a lot of zest to your meals and to your proteins without adding extra salt, which is something we're just going to keep going back to throughout this whole presentation. Okay. So let's talk a little history of herbs. So herbs and spices have been used in foods for centuries. Archaeologists estimate that by 50,000 BC, primitive man had already discovered the parts of certain aromatic plants that help make food taste better. And the spices were once so costly that only the wealthy could afford them. And when you think of this now, it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit because, you know, we take things like pepper for granted. We can go to the dollar store and buy a little container of it, right? Many towns paid their taxes and rents with pepper. And the reason for Columbus's voyage in 1492 was to see a more direct passage to the rich spices of the Orient. So, you know, what we take for granted today, you know, and it's just a staple in our homes, was once something that only the very privileged had access to. Okay. So when we talk about, I'm sure you've all heard the word antioxidant. All right? So by definition, antioxidants are substances that protect cells from damage caused by these unstable molecules. They're disease causers called free radicals. Okay? And by consuming antioxidant-rich foods, the benefits range from fending off age-related wrinkles to prevention of chronic disease such as heart disease and cancer. So some examples of well-known antioxidants include things like vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene. Anybody tell me where we can get some beta-carotene? What vegetables would have beta-carotene in it? Anybody want to venture a guess even? I'm sure you eat it every day. Carrots, very good, Sheila. Yep, carrots for sure. Now, and then you got it right before, you got it right under the deadline. I was going to say it. Sweet potatoes is another great example of beta-carotene, food that's very high in beta-carotene, which is definitely beneficial for your eyes and eye health. There's also something called quercetin, which is in citrus fruits. Resveratrol in red grapes. That's what gives red grapes its color. Rosmarinic acid, which is found in rosemary, basil, and oregano. So it's really neat to know that you can get these health benefits and this antioxidant punch in something just like a teaspoon of some very simple herbs and spices, right? It doesn't always have to be, food-based. Okay, most think of antioxidants as coming, as I said, strictly from foods like fruits and vegetables, but many herbs and spices not only provide flavor, but as we just saw, that big punch of antioxidants. So here are some examples. A half a teaspoon of ground cloves, which is very popular when we bake, not only provide flavor, but a big punch of it. Oh, I'm sorry. A half a teaspoon, sorry, I lost my place. Half a teaspoon of ground cloves is said to contain more antioxidants than a half a cup of blueberries. Or a teaspoon of dried oregano has the antioxidant equivalent of 1 cup of sweet potatoes. So super simple whether you are making some pasta sauce, red sauce, or you are making a dry rub for beef or chicken or fish. You can just add so much more to it by just adding a few sprinkles of your dried or fresh herbs. Okay, so this is kind of some interesting information. Typically, fresh herbs and spices contain higher levels of antioxidants than dried or processed. The reason for this is because the drying process itself, the herbs kind of lose some of their punch. But the drying helps with extending the storage life on that, okay? So yes, when you dry the herbs, it's just that drying process that ends up causing it to lose a little bit of its antioxidant punch. But still, as you'll hear in a second, it still has the ability to still have some of that beneficial health aspect. So, for example, fresh garlic is 1.5 times more powerful than dry garlic. However, if we look at something like, I'll give you another example. So fresh basil, 1 ounce of fresh basil is 145% of the daily values for vitamin K. Okay? A tablespoon of dry basil, 43% of the daily values for vitamin K. So yeah, while there was, maybe a third of what in the dried is what was in the fresh, you're still getting a heck of an antioxidant punch. So the whole point of my sharing that with you is just to say that, don't undervalue, the importance of still having these herbs and spices, whether they're in dried form because that's just what's easier for you or more accessible as opposed to fresh, okay? And you can very easily, if you have your fresh, you can easily make your own dried. And that's by just kind of picking them and hanging them upside down and letting them dry out, okay? And I'll just share another little tidbit of information for you that you do need to make sure that you hang them upside down because much of the nutrients will then go into the leaves. You know, it's gravity here that we're talking about. So just little things like that can make a difference. So if you're a DIYer kind of person, keep that in mind. If you're going to dry your herbs, make sure they're hung upside down. All right. So let's talk about the top 10. The following 10 culinary herbs and spices show particular promise for promoting good health. All right, curcumin. So curcumin is found in turmeric and curry powder, and they have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, antiviral, antibacterial, and antifungal properties with potential activity against things like cancer, diabetes, arthritis, Alzheimer's, and other chronic diseases. Now, I want to say this from the beginning. I want to be clear. While all of these have promise for promoting good health, they are not a substitute for going to a provider and getting appropriate care when needed, okay? So, you know, I think these are a great everyday supplement to your diet and your intakes, but just do not substitute them for proper care and medicine when necessary. All right, nutmeg. So this nutmeg displays antibacterial activity towards H. pylori. And H. pylori was the bacteria that can cause, they found people with certain types of ulcers, peptic ulcers specifically. That was the bacteria that was causing that. So this can display antibacterial activity towards that, as well as gastritis and E. coli, which is a form of food poisoning. Okay. Cinnamon, antioxidant capacity, as well as a modest ability to act like insulin and lowering glucose levels in patients with poorly controlled diabetes. So again, I just want to say, this is not like you should be taking spoonfuls of cinnamon instead of insulin. All right, but it definitely, as just good practice with giving your food flavor, it can also certainly help with that if an individual happens to have poorly controlled diabetes. All right, hot peppers. So cayenne pepper is a concentrated source of something called capsaicin that not only gives chilies their heat, but can decrease the risk of certain cancers by targeting a variety of pathways involved in cancer development and inflammation. Capsaicin and its relatives are also powerful analgesics or pain relievers. Okay? Garlic contains substances that are now being studied for their anti-cancer effects. There is some evidence that points to consuming between a half and 1 full clove of garlic a day can lower cholesterol up to 9%. So these are just simple ways that you can tweak what you're cooking and how you're cooking it, and possibly have extended health benefits beyond what you even would have imagined. But again, not a substitute for medicine. Okay. Oregano. It has the highest antioxidant activity of 27 culinary herbs and 12 medicinal herbs that were tested, ranking higher than a lot of fruits and vegetables. Oregano also has antimicrobial properties that work against salmonella and E. coli and other forms of food poisoning. Rosemary possesses antioxidant and antimicrobial properties as well as anti-cancer prevention. The aromatherapy effects, all right, which has to do with your sense of smell, are being studied, regarding its relationship to relieving pain and improving mood. Lots of things going on with herbs and spices. Ginger, I'm sure most of you have probably heard this one. Dry ginger may be effective for nausea and vomiting, but specifically as it relates to pregnancy, at least in the studies, they have not shown effectiveness related to motion sickness and chemotherapy, although I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people out there, myself included, who on occasion have taken it when you've just felt like the motion sickness kind of, and it's helped. So always a possibility. Some compounds in ginger have been shown to exhibit anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity. And our last two, we have mint. Peppermint has significant antimicrobial and antiviral activity, as well as strong antioxidant and anti-tumor potential. Some studies have shown that it has a relaxation effect on your GI tissue. So like if you have an upset stomach, sometimes chewing on mint leaves can help. And it acts as an analgesic or a pain reliever. Okay? And lastly is basil. This is one of the medicinal plants widely used in several countries, including Morocco, to reduce cholesterol and the risk of atherosclerosis-related diseases, heart disease. Basil extract contains substances that have also shown some protection against certain cancers. So these things are based in study and research. They're always changing and coming along, but again, I just want to stress that this is not a substitute for appropriate medical care and medicine when necessary. Okay. Something else I just want to share with you. The American Institute for Cancer Research notes that herbs and spices should be used as flavor enhancers because of their health protective phytochemicals, which can help fight, as we've already heard, against cancer and other diseases, much like those found in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and other plant-based foods. I want you to think in terms of big picture, right? And looking to incorporate these on a daily basis in your meals and food preparation, as well as a great way to reduce sodium, all right? And before we kind of change gears, one other thing I want to leave you with. One or all three of the following things can almost always be added to a dish to add flavor in lieu of salt: citrus, vinegar, and or spices. So before we move on to something about basic vinegar infusions, do y'all have any questions or comments on this? No? All right, we'll keep it moving. All right, let's talk about basic vinegar infusions. Has anybody made any of these before? Because these are like super easy to make. And actually, if you go looking in the store online, gourmet bottles of infused vinegars can run anywhere from like 15 to 30 bucks a bottle. So, you know, if you make these at home and you keep them refrigerated, they'll last a really long time, and you'll be spending more money on just getting a pretty bottle. So definitely something to think about. These also add a lot of flavor to meat and fish, but also to your bottom line, because they're expensive. They're prohibitively expensive if you buy them on your own, right? And in general, just to keep in mind, it's a 1-to-1 ratio of fruit. If you put fruit to vinegar, or fruit and herbs to vinegar. All right, so a few things to keep in mind. Use a good quality vinegar, either white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar, rice wine vinegar, or apple cider vinegar. Not apple cider flavored distilled vinegar. Save the distilled vinegar for things like washing your windows, okay? So apple cider vinegar, besides containing acid, also contains antioxidants called polyphenols. And it's also slightly higher in vitamins and minerals than distilled vinegar. And you know, the thing about distilled vinegar is it's really kind of harsh flavor-wise, and it's sour. So that can tend to overpower the other more delicate things like the herbs and spices or the fruit that you're putting in. And I would kind of save that for more like pickling, distilled vinegar for pickling, than making these infused vinegars. And then you want to make sure that your vinegar is at least 5% acidity, and that will that'll say it right on the front label, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, so what do we need tool-wise? We're talking about bamboo skewers, long and short, a plastic funnel, and plastic measuring spoons. Never use any metal utensils or bowls for marinating or preparing any vinegar. Simple reason for that is metal, including some stainless steel, can actually react with the acid, and then it'll take on the taste of that metal, which is something we definitely don't want. All right, so plastic, glass, ceramic, not metal. Important, so we never use any metal utensils of any kind to prepare or store vinegar. This includes the stopper as well. All right. We also want to stay away from ground herbs or spices, as this is going to make the vinegar cloudy. And we don't want to store our vinegars in any sunny windows, as this is also going to make the vinegar kind of cloudy looking and not very pretty. All right. Fresh herbs, if we're going to use herbs and spices. So fresh herbs should be gently washed and patted dry with a paper towel. The same if you use fruit. And 1 teaspoon of dried herbs can be substituted for a tablespoon of fresh herbs for flavor. So that's just kind of a basic recipe to keep in mind. All right. Now, this list is by no means a complete list. However, it gives you a great jumping off point. All right, so some good combinations. Well, rosemary and everything. Rosemary is really flavorful and it's a super hearty herb. Parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme, tarragon and garlic, dill, garlic and dried pepper, red peppers, basil, garlic and dried red peppers, opal basil, there's purple, there's all kinds of basils. I mean, if you know, now that the farmers markets are all starting to open up, that's a great place to go and get your herb starts. And I mean, I bought mine a week ago and they're already twice the size. I was shocked how fast they started to grow. So that's a great place to get some, pick up some favorite combinations and start playing around with that in your vinegars. Opal basil with white wine, it turns it pink, but that's pretty pink. Pineapple sage blossoms with white wine vinegar, it turns it kind of a reddish color. It sounds delicious. Pineapple sage, ginger, cranberries, and garlic. Pineapple sage, spearmint, and lemon thyme. That sounds like it would be lovely with chicken. Lemon thyme and sage, just a few examples of things you could do to play with those flavor combinations. All right, so the question now becomes, now that I've made it, what can I do with it? So some simple things you can do with it. Herb vinegar can be used in cooking in equal amounts where wine, fruit juice, plain vinegar, lemon or lime juice is called for. You can add it to bottled barbecue sauce. Or you can use it in your favorite vinaigrette dressing. 1 part vinegar to 2 or 3 parts olive oil, salt and pepper to taste, or use it as just a general marinade. Anybody else have any ideas how we could use this? Anyone? Let's see, Mildred's typing. How long after you add the vinegar should you wait before using it? That's a really great question. So I would say I'd give it 2 or 3 days to really kind of set in, and then I would just taste it. Pour some out in a spoon and taste it. I think a lot of it is going to be, you know, it's going to steep over time, and depending on how strong it is with what you're using and how strong you want it to taste is going to determine how long. But just keep in mind that the longer you have it, it's going to, you know, kind of marinate in that and get stronger over time anyway. So, and then that would depend on maybe putting in more or less herb or fruit to make it stronger to begin with. So, you know, you might want to start with just a small bottle and kind of play with it to see whether you like something, you like that combination, and you like it really strong or a little more mild. Okay. All right, so other things that you can do with these is reduce fat. So by removing 1 tablespoon of fat, it removes what represents about 100 calories, which could equal 10 pounds of weight loss in a year. So when you use these kind of infused vinegars, you're really adding a lot of punch of flavor and reducing the fat. The calories in herbs and spices are far less than what you would find in breading, batters, gravies, sauces, and, you know, frying foods. right? You can get just as much a flavor punch. Also, reducing sugar. So you can reduce or eliminate sugar by using some sweet-tasting spices like allspice, anise, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, mace, and nutmeg. All right, and as we talked about consistently, reducing salt. So savory flavors like black pepper, garlic powder, curry powder, cumin, dill seeds, basil, ginger, coriander, onion. Those are all nice and savory, that umami kind of flavor profile, which kind of, can give you that vibe of, savory, salty, but without adding the sodium. You can omit salt when you're cooking pasta and flavor it with things like basil, oregano, parsley, and pepper. Use that Italian seasoning blend. Now, when garlic powder and onion powder is the preferred spice to use as opposed to garlic salt and onion salt for the obvious reason. And you also want to check your labels to see if salt or sodium are listed among the ingredients. And if they are, you probably want to switch out to something else. So Mrs. Dash to use another great option that uses a lot of these dried herbs and spices, but no salt. All right, so when we talk about working with herbs and spices, right, sometimes the question comes up, okay, well, I don't know when do I add it, the beginning or the end? So if you think in terms of dried, you want to add the dried herbs and spices, whole spices in the beginning because they release their flavors slowly, right? Ground releases their flavors quickly, so that's probably something you want to add at the end. Mildred, I see your question about salt. So Mildred's asking, what's the difference between pink salt and regular salt? Is one better than the other? No, it really is where they're coming from, what part of the world they're coming from, because it comes from the ground, so it has to do with the other minerals that are in there and that composition. So, and I think, though, pink salt tends to be very chunky, so I'm not sure that, I don't know how that melts. I've not worked with it myself. I tend to just, when I use salt, I'll use kosher salt. But one is not better than the other. No, salt is salt, in a nutshell. But we want to modify the amount, obviously, that we use. But I'm not honestly sure how how pink salt works. Like I said, I've seen it as pretty chunky, so something to experiment with, but very intentionally, because we want to keep our sodium levels to a minimum. So getting back to, but good question, thank you. If we're using crumbled herbs and spices, now, depending on what kind it is, so if you have a more mild herb like basil, it's best to add it toward the end of cooking. And if you have something that's more robust like thyme or even rosemary, that can stand a longer cooking time. Okay. We want to make sure that we are storing in tightly covered containers. Oxidation occurs, and so when oxygen gets to it, it's only a matter of a couple of days and they start to get black. You want to store them in a dark place, dried herbs, a dark place away from sunlight, and avoid storing above the dishwasher, microwave, stove, refrigerator, near sink or heating vent. Outside of the sink, because that's a lot of moisture, the others produce a lot of heat, and that'll cause damage to your herbs. Now, avoid sprinkling dried herbs or spices directly from a container into a hot pot to prevent moisture from entering the container, and again, it leads toward spoilage. And use a spoon to measure spices and herbs from a container rather than putting your hand in. Our hands, no matter how many times we wash it, our skin has a lot of microbes on it, and that, again, could affect the shelf life of the herb or spice. Couple of other things I want to share with you about storing herbs and spices. Fresh herbs can be stored in an open or perforated plastic bag in the fridge crisper drawer for just a few days, though. Again, that moisture and oxygen gets in there and it starts to turn them black, and they're not pretty and they're not going to taste good. You don't want to use them at that point. Now, there are also a couple of ways that you can freeze herbs. So one is by washing and draining them and then patting them dry with a paper towel. And then you can wrap a few sprigs or leaves in freezer wrap and place them in a freezer bag. You can then just seal it and freeze it. Another method is cutting them into tiny pieces and filling the sections of an ice cube tray about half full with herbs, and then cover them with water and freeze them until they're solid. And then you just throw them into your soup, your stews, your sauces as needed. The water will evaporate and you're good to go. And then one last way, another version of that, is you can just simply puree your washed herbs in a blender or a spice grinder with a small amount of water. You're kind of almost making like a paste, and then pouring that into the ice cube tray and freezing until solid. So it's a little more concentrated version, but super easy. Okay. So as a general rule, you want to keep your herbs and spices for a year. Keep ground herbs and spices for a year, whole spices for 2 years. Now, I know, I will say, I have had dried herbs and spices that are probably older than that. Because I think sometimes we think, oh, they're dry, they can last forever. Not really. So a couple of ways, though, but again, it depends. It depends on how humid it is in your pantry or wherever you're keeping them. So it's temperature, exposure to light, all those things will impact how long you keep them. But a couple of things to keep in mind to know whether it's time to throw them out or you can keep using them. So if a spice or herb smells strong and flavorful, it's probably still potent. So this is one instance where I would say, yes, smelling it, you can tell. Would I do that with other foods? Probably not. But herbs and spices, I think it's okay. Rub a small amount of a ground herb in your palm, and if the aroma is rich and it's like immediate, it's pungent, it can still flavor foods, so you're still good to go. But you want to probably avoid smelling things like pepper or chili powder for the obvious reasons. Irritate you or make you start sneezing. It's not a good feeling. Okay. The last thing I want to leave you with is something called the Complete Idiot's Guide to Spices and Herbs. I found this online and I thought it was so cool, so I've left it as a separate handout for you all to be able to resource on your own and kind of go through it. It's cheaper than buying a book. It's a 280-page online book of anything and everything you want to know about herbs and spices, including the history, drawing your own, medicinal uses, creating a garden, all good stuff that we've talked about and then some. And I just thought, especially now, this is a great time to take a look at something like that and start to get creative. So before we part, just wondering if you all have any questions or any comments about today's group, anything you'd like to share, or any additional resources that you've used that you want to share with the group before we go. I am glad that you enjoyed it. Thank you. And I hope you guys really do take a good look at this this guide. I think it'll be really cool. I'm so glad you all liked it. I think it's kind of fun, and I think it's just a great time of year to start really giving this some consideration. So I just want to thank all of you for being a part of the group today. And I wish you all good seasonings. And before you leave, please make sure I'll set you up for the survey so you can give us your feedback on it. Looking forward to hearing that. All right. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great week. And thanks for hanging in there with me, even though we had